Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I'm one of your hosts, Brian Fleming. I'm here as always with my friend, colleague, and co-host from the Great White North, Mr. Timothy O'Toole. How are you, Tim?
I'm doing great, Brian. I'm doing great. It's a very cold day here, but doing good. I've got some yoga swag on. I'm doing pretty well.
And it's going to be light out for another 15 minutes or so. So you're loving life.
Exactly. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Exactly. Welcome back to Embargoed. A mini milestone. This is episode 40 for us. So that's pretty good. Pretty good. We're going to save the big black tie gala for probably episode 50 or maybe episode 100. But, worth noting, episode 40.
We're getting there. This is like, we've got a real podcast at this point.
Contrary to what some may think. But thank you all for coming back once again. Appreciate all the feedback and comments from the last episode. We heard from a number of folks. Always appreciate that. As always, before we get started, we're not giving legal advice. We're not sharing any confidential information. Any and all opinions and comments you hear today are solely the product of Mr. O'Toole and my own somewhat skewed brains. And so blame us if you do not agree or do not like anything you hear today. If you do like the pod, please spread the word. Please subscribe. Please give us a rating, hopefully a 5-star rating. And you can find us in where you get your pod content. So this is going to be, just a quick word of housekeeping before we jump into the roadmap. So we're recording this just before Thanksgiving in the States here. It is Monday, November 22nd when we record. This will not be going up until I think shortly after Thanksgiving in the States. So very end of November. We likely will only be coming back for one more episode in 2022, which we will be, I think we're still debating whether we keep the exact same format, but will be something akin to our top 10 stories or most interesting topics of 2021, just like we did last year. So stay tuned for that. We will record that at some point in early mid-December, put that up just before the end of the year and the holidays. So I'm certainly thankful that this year's almost over. I think I probably said that last year, but I think it's worth repeating this year.
Back-to-back bad years.
Back-to-back tough years. Yeah. Just grinding it out. Happy to be here. Happy to be healthy, vaccinated, thriving. So can't really complain that much. But yeah, it has been a grind as we know it has for many of you out there. So not to be forgotten. Definitely something to be thankful for. And with that, let me get into what we're going to cover today. Unless Tim, you have some thoughts.
Just very quickly, just think about how great 2022 is going to be when you compare them to 2020 and 2021. So that's the glass half full version, I think.
We would think. I would think that, although we do have the midterm elections coming up next year, which I'm sure is going to be just a laugh riot in the United States. So there is that to look forward to. But in any event, I think that's right. Tim is always a glass half full kind of guy. An eternal optimist and a magician with his sanctions and export control wand. So I will get on board with that train as well. And we're going to think positive thoughts for 2022 for sure. But before we get there, and on our last kind of regular episode of Embargoed for 2021, here's what we're going to cover today. So a bit of an interesting collection of topics today, actually, a number of things that we haven't talked about previously or don't talk about often, interspersed with a few things we talk about incessantly. So it'll be sort of a good mix. We're going to actually start with Ethiopia, which is something we have touched upon very briefly when the new executive order came out, but we're going to dive into that a little more as there has been more action with regard to the brand new Ethiopia program recently. We're going to talk then about the Cambodia Business Advisory, which is also pretty fresh, pretty new. We're going to talk about election interference by not Russia, Iran. So lest anybody think that Russia has the market cornered on election interference in the U.S., you would be mistaken. We're going to cover that, and then we're going to talk about Russia, and we're going to talk about a couple of our favorite topics with regard to Russia. One being Ukraine, another being the perilous state of Europe's energy supply vis-a-vis Nordstrom 2 and other sources of potential Russian interference and extortion. So that's the main set of topics for today. And then in the lightning round, two topics One of which is whether or not the U.S. is going to engage in a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics, which has been in the news recently. I think it's fascinating for a lot of reasons, and including a number of the reasons that we talk about for U.S. trade policy with respect to China on a regular basis. So we're gonna talk about that briefly, and then we're gonna talk about the Burundi sanctions program, which was just put to an end very recently. RIP, the Burundi sanctions program. So that is our show for today. Any thoughts before we kick off, Tim?
No, it is a smorgasbord of countries and programs. So good for all of those obscure program fans out there that never get enough. never the most underrated sanctions programs. Maybe
for the people
that episode one
for
time.
the people who tweet at us and say we want more Burundi content, this is for you.
This you.
Episode. Yeah, we're our hats are off to you. So anyway, a small but vocal minority of our fan base, I would say. So in any event, so let's jump into it. So topic number one is, as I said, the new Ethiopia executive order, and more to the point, some designations that were just announced very recently, about 10 days ago. So shortly after we recorded the last episode. So to wind back just briefly here, there was a new executive order that was signed by President Biden in September. We talked about it very briefly, I think, shortly after it came out. This was standing up a brand new program, OFAC program. And what was signaled there at the time, which I think is what I really want to come back to, is kind of how targeted and narrowly tailored both the authorization to impose sanctions was in terms of the scope of the executive order. It was a menu-based sanctions program that included the possibility to impose blocking sanctions, but a menu-based sanctions program. And notably, I should have gone back to the archives, but notably at the time, the FAQs and the press release and the communications that Treasury put out on this were very, very adamant about the fact that there would be no 50% rule that would apply with respect to blocking sanctions or any other sanctions that were being imposed under the new Ethiopia sanctions program. And the flip side of that being that the full intent and design of the program was to ensure that U.S. actions and actions of U.S. allies were not going to dry up, hinder, or otherwise obstruct efforts by humanitarian groups, NGOs, and other foreign aid groups to continue to help out with the growing, worsening humanitarian crisis in Ethiopia that has been brought about by the civil war that is ongoing there. And so that's critical, and I'll come back to that in a second. So, and then to further wind it back, Ethiopia, of course, a longstanding U.S. ally, very critical in the Horn of Africa to U.S. efforts to combat terrorism, especially in the wake of 9/11, has been seen as a very stable regional partner until just recently. And now, of course, in the last year or two, under the current government that is in power in Ethiopia, there has been a heightening of tensions and now armed conflict with rebel groups in the northern part of the country. And that has kind of kicked off what we're now seeing in terms of this worsening crisis and what I think was the impetus for creating the executive order in the program. So a few days ago, about 10 days ago, as I mentioned, we see the first designations that are issued here. They are mostly targeted at Eritrean actors and those who are affiliated with the Eritrean government, and that are, by virtue of the Treasury and State Department statements on this, are seen as kind of exacerbating or worsening or contributing to the general kind of suffering and of the conflict that's going on in Ethiopia at the moment. And so, again, a small number of actors that are really targeted there. Notably, when the EO was originally rolled out, it was very clear messaging that this is not meant to sort of be targeted at Ethiopia as a whole, Eritrea as a whole. It was really meant to go to the root of the actors that were, at least in the eyes of the U.S. government and its allies, are kind of exacerbating, inflaming, and making this situation worse, and are preventing some kind of a potential negotiated resolution to the conflict there, which is the kind of stated goal of the U.S. and its allies. So my big question is, and again, when the new designations came out, the same kind of notes were struck about how narrowly tailored the sanctions are. No 50% rule applies here, and that this is really meant to be kind of a surgical strike, if you will, with the sanctions tool to try to get at the actors that are, at least in the eyes of the U.S. government or the U.S. policymakers, are kind of most responsible for the worsening of the situation in Ethiopia, and especially in the north. So my question to you, Mr. O'Toole, this strikes me as a kind of fascinating test case for the sort of new operating principles that OFAC and the Biden administration are bringing to bear when it comes to, levying new sanctions, rolling out new programs, trying to kind of, really give a little more thought and care and nuance to the way that they are claiming to be very mindful of the humanitarian consequences and the collateral consequences of sanctions actions, and not trying to do this, not trying to bludgeon, disfavored actors into submission, but taking a very surgical, precise approach to trying to do this in a way that is not going to have too many follow-on consequences that are going to be detrimental to the people on the ground that the U.S. government is claiming it wants to protect and wants to serve. So my question to you is, what do you think of this approach? What do you think of this action in light of the executive order 14046 that is underlying the Ethiopia program, and how do we think this is going to play out?
So I like it. I mean, in theory, I really like it because sanctions do have a lot of unintended consequences, and they aren't very precise in many parts of the world. And the 50% rule creates even less precision because you can't even really tell who's sanctioned. So you almost have to assume that everybody that's anywhere close to the company that's sanctioned, because otherwise there might be an ownership chain that you don't know about. You start talking about an Ethiopia sanctions program. The banks hear Ethiopia when they see it in the news, and then all of a sudden you can't do any banking in Ethiopia, even though that's clearly not the intent of this. And so kind of both a speaking approach from OFAC to say these are narrow and targeted and Ethiopia is not under sanctions, that these are really just directed at the conflict in northern Ethiopia that is spilled over from Eritrea. The first sanctioned parties are for Eritrean, not Ethiopian. It's all good. I'll be curious to see two things. One is, does it work to really shut down the behavior of the actors that they're trying to get at? Because the problem with this approach is, and the reason that OFAC often uses a broader approach, is that it's really hard to sanction everybody when you go into the area that you want to get. And so there's some kind of both strategic ambiguity, but then also when they do these embargo programs, it's not even ambiguity. It's just Iran is under sanctions, so presumptively you can't do anything in Iran. And yeah, there's lots of transactions that would be allowed in Iran, but that won't get done as a result of that, like humanitarian transactions, for example, that are going to be deterred. But we're okay with that because we want to put some real pressure on Iran, and we don't want to have a lot of holes in the sanctions. Here, when you have them so targeted, you worry that, for example, there's no 50% rule. So if a company gets sanctioned, they can just have their subsidiary do the same thing. And yeah, OFAC will probably catch them eventually, but how quickly? So if you essentially just move all the resources to the sub, can the behavior go on without really being deterred? I mean, that's the reason for the 50% rule, and we'll see if that works. And in the same way, like, how much of this stuff that's going on in terms of the attacks on humanitarian workers that prompted the sanctions, the violence, the government corruption that's going on, or the corruption that's going on in northern Ethiopia, how much of that continues? How much of that can they really stop with this sort of sanctional behavior? And if they do stop it, does it have this sort of spillover effect where, it's interfering with other sorts of trade? I mean, it's really the balance that you've got to do to get the sanctions policy right. You want to go big enough to stop the behavior you want to deter, but not so big that you cut off a lot of other behavior that you don't want to deter. OFAC has often chosen to go too big and cut off a little bit more than maybe it wanted to because it wants to make sure that it gets all the bad behavior. Now it's going small. We'll see if it gets all the bad behavior but doesn't get the behavior that it's actually trying to let go.
Yeah, what I would add to this is just for context for anybody who hasn't seen the press release on this or the designations, the folks that are the entities and the people who are targeted here who have been designated, it is the Eritrean military and it is the Eritrean the sole sanctioned or sole recognized political party in Eritrea, along with a couple of individuals and then a holding company that holds many of the sort of assets and other kind of economic drivers and enterprises of that political party, and another entity that controls sort of property and financial interests. So, to me, this is they're clearly trying to exert pain on these actors in a very specific way to limit it and to thereby get them to change behavior and either sort of step aside and allow there to be some kind of talks, or maybe even make them a driver to have talks, because if they say, well, now we are in a materially worse position than we were before because of the sanctions, and we don't have access to, we have two main sort of cogs of government that are now that are subject to blocking sanctions, and these economic interests that are now tied up because of the blocking sanctions. We need to put an end to this, and will that be enough? I don't know, but clearly that is the kind of surgical maneuver they're going for here, and whether or not that will work will be interesting. And in the meantime, what that will do for anybody who has ongoing interests in the region or in these two countries, how that will impact the way that people are looking at these things is I think an open question, and whether they will take the kind of typical blanket we're staying away view, or whether they will sort of read between the lines and say, okay, there's maybe more we can do here, but we're now in the midst of kind of this waiting game to see whether the sanctions have the desired effect. Will be kind of fascinating to see. But I do really think this is kind of a fascinating test case that we haven't really seen yet, and perhaps this is what the administration wanted to happen in Burma, let's say, or in other places, but that there maybe wasn't. And again, I'm not exactly sure the sort of what leverage and what impact this is going to have, but certainly you can see the telegraphing of what this is supposed to do, or hopefully going to do, from a U.S. perspective. So, time will tell if this really does change behavior and sort of get them to stand down, or maybe even be a force for, to prompt further discussions and talks to resolve the situation.
Yeah, it seems very surgical. So I think that's good. And it's also, I think, and we'll talk about it in a couple of the other segments. I mean, it's another good example of the new administration being focused on kind of different issues in terms of sanctions than certainly the last administration was. I mean, this was really focused on, some human rights and corruption issues in northern Ethiopia, resulting in the spillover from a conflict in Eritrea, and it's not kind of the we don't like Ethiopia's foreign policy. It's not even really we don't like Eritrea's foreign policy. It's like we're trying to stop, at least to contain, this one type of behavior, and we're going to do it in a very targeted way. And it's kind of a different type of behavior than sanctions are often targeted at, and it is certainly very surgical compared to some of the other programs.
Yeah, no, agreed. So in any event, we'll leave that behind for now. That's I think it is just an interesting test case. So anybody out there who's kind of following this generally, I mean, I just saw remarks from someone at the State Department who's the special envoy for the U.S. to the Horn of Africa, who said, in sum, if you told me 9 months ago or a year ago that I would have this job and that my number one concern or worry would be Ethiopia, I would have said you're crazy. And I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but this has really inflamed to a point that it is of significant concern in the region, obviously, and to the U.S. and its allies. So it'll be interesting to see how this kind of plays out. But it is a a different approach, and so we'll see what that approach yields, but something to be watching. So with that, let's shift gears and go on to let's go across to Cambodia.
Well, we'll go to Cambodia, and it does kind of continue the theme. I mean, as I was just talking about with Ethiopia, I mean, these are issues that are not always, or really in the last 5 years or so, have not often been the province of sanctions, although that's really changing. You've got a situation in Cambodia that appears that the U.S. is becoming concerned that Cambodia is ripe with corruption. This is, somewhat on the heels of President Biden's announcement last summer that stopping corruption is going to be a much bigger priority of his administration, and that they are going to use all the powers within all the tools within the government's toolkit to go after corruption. And one of those tools is sanctions, and it's actually the Global Magnitsky program, which has been around for a while at this point, where sanctions can be imposed for governmental corruption. And so on November 10th, in Cambodia, the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control sanctioned 2 Cambodian government officials. One's Chow Pirun, and I'm sure I'm saying his name wrong, but they call him Chow in the listing, and then T Vin, who they call him T in the listing. And Chow and T are high-ranking members of the Cambodian military, and they were sanctioned because OFAC believes that they were involved in the building of a project called Ream Naval Base by the Cambodian government, and they were apparently funneling some of the proceeds from the project into their own coffers. So they were skimming some of the funds, and they were apparently conspiring to inflate the costs, which, presumably they worked with the defense contractors there to inflate the costs, or at least that's what the government believes. And so the OFAC put them onto the SDN list pursuant to the GLOMAG EO, which is 13818, as part of this corruption. Now, that alone probably wouldn't have warranted a segment. But the other thing that the government did on November 10th was it came out with a Cambodia Business Advisory on high-risk investments and interactions. And basically, State, Treasury, and Commerce put together an advisory that talked about the risks of, it's mostly corruption within Cambodia, but also money laundering risk. And so I found the advisory to be relatively surprising, in the sense that Cambodia has apparently grown so much over the last 10 to 15 years, that the banking system has expanded without a lot of oversight. All sorts of other industries have grown, real estate, casinos, infrastructure is being built at a rapid pace. And with all of these, at least in Cambodia, have come what the U.S. believes to be a pretty wild amount of corruption. And so these designations were announced at the same time that this advisory was put out. I think that would have to be seen in that context as a warning shot to Cambodia, but also, there's when you read through this advisory, in terms of the advice to financial institutions in particular, there's a lot of emphasis on due diligence for whatever investment is going on in Cambodia. And so I suspect that coming out of this, that both U.S. and non-U.S. financial institutions will be doing a lot of due diligence with respect to their Cambodian transactions, Cambodian customers, any interactions with the Cambodian banking system, any sort of transactions that touch on either Cambodian real estate, casino, infrastructure. Any of that, I think, is going to be subject to a much higher level of scrutiny coming out of this. And I think that probably those 2 designations are the first, but not the last designations of that sort that we'll see coming out of Cambodia.
Yeah, so the joint advisory that was put out rang in a very similar tone to me to what we saw a few months ago on Xinjiang. And it was kind of a broad, shot across the bow to an entire region or country in this instance, to really put everybody on notice, in particular those who are in some of the industries or maybe thinking about investing or engaging in projects in certain industries that Tim mentioned, on notice of the, really just systemic risk that exists here in doing business in these areas. And it's not so much, there's the GLOMAG designations that Tim mentioned at the outset. Clearly, there could be more coming there. But I think more than that, there was just again, this has become the trend now with the U.S. government agencies kind of to market and bring awareness to these issues in a impactful way by teaming up, issuing these advisories, packing into, one place, this one 13-page document, lots and lots of sordid details about everything that's going on in Cambodia, whether from, prior criminal matters or other actions or other sort of sources that the U.S. has been able to kind of cull together. And, taken together, it is quite a damning document that really calls out and calls to attention just an incredibly risky environment to do business in a nutshell. And I would add a couple of sort of additional or final thoughts to that as well. Clearly, the financial sector is kind of front and center here, not surprisingly, because this is, Treasury is one of the architects of this advisory. If you read carefully through the description of this, the expansion of the banking industry and the microfinance industry in Cambodia in particular, it might as well have been written in like red highlighter in the advisory. It was really being written with everybody needs to pay attention to how risky this is, and the fact that there is no regulation locally on any of this, and these are just in many instances conduits for illicit activities, and including human trafficking, drug trafficking, money laundering of all kinds, etc. So that's a big thing. Another thing is they call out in here, and it's further down in the advisory, but it is a highly relevant point. This is not news to those in the financial industry, strictly speaking, especially in the more sophisticated kind of global financial institutions, because Cambodia was added to, not only do they rank very poorly on all of the kind of anti-corruption indexes, but in 2019, they were added to the FATF gray list. So they have been identified previously as being a high risk for AML and counter-terrorist financing, not that long ago. And so they're firmly on the radar of the big global financial institutions in this regard. And anything that gets routed through Cambodia, and the fact that it is a largely, unbanked or cash-based economy in many instances, I think just adds to that risk. But, that is something certainly to be aware of as well. And I think, again, just in the industries that Tim mentioned, sort of casinos, infrastructure, some of these other things that are called out specifically, no doubt that those folks, anybody who's engaging in or thinking about engaging in projects in those areas, this is now, alarm bells are sounding, and there has to be some thought given as to whether or not that is sort of something within your risk appetite as to whether or not you can endure that or not. And then, but secondly, I think just again, sort of the real sustained focus on the financial sort of sector in Cambodia, and kind of how much the advisory kind of calls into question the integrity of that system, the oversight that's accorded to that system, and how anybody who is doing anything with Cambodia, routing things through Cambodia, has to, I think, now be considered to be noticed up and on alert that this is something you have to account for if you're engaging in any transactions that flow through Cambodia.
Yeah, I think if my recollection is right, I think that Xinjiang was the last advisory that was done similar to this with respect to a particular region. And you can see in the last 6 months how the enforcement activity with respect to Xinjiang province has just exploded. I suspect we may not see something as huge with Cambodia, but I suspect there will be a big uptick in enforcement actions and in certainly in compliance actions because of the targeting of the financial industry. I think we'll see a lot more transactions that are routed through Cambodia that don't make it.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So in any event, I think this is probably just the beginning of what we're going to see with respect to Cambodia from OFAC and from other U.S. agencies. So, just kind of, again, one that we're just kind of planting a flag on for the moment.
Stay tuned
to be aware of. Yeah, but that's going to be, I think the noise there is likely to grow over time, and as a compliance risk, and just something to be aware of for those who perhaps weren't treating it on the same level as some of the other countries that we spend a lot of time talking about otherwise. So let's leave Cambodia behind for the moment. Let's shift over to Iran. So just recently, just last week actually, there were a couple things that happened in concert. So number one, there were a series of designations that came down from OFAC that targeted Iranian cyber actors and an Iranian entity, or a couple of one entity and 6 individuals that were targeted for sanctions under the election EO for attempting to interfere in the 2020 U.S. presidential election through a variety of different schemes, some of which involved actual breaches of, or at least attempted breaches of, state election infrastructure, sending intimidating messages to voters, spreading disinformation, and the like. So there was a whole host of different activities there. Interestingly, a handful of those folks were already designated under other OFAC authorities because of their ties to the IRGC. So this will tell you that these are folks that are kind of integral to the Iranian defense and intelligence infrastructure, and are now, at least now, have been identified in sort of a slightly different context for election interference. With that, on the same day, I believe there was an indictment unsealed that charged 2 of those same individuals. Essentially, the two individuals who were charged with being kind of behind the keyboard and manning the infrastructure that was responsible for actually carrying out these attacks and sending these messages that were directed at the U.S. With a variety of crimes, the first couple of which relate to the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and unauthorized access to certain U.S. computers and servers in an attempt to, as I said, sort of obtain access to voter information and the like, and then to send some of these messages again to voters to tamper with. In one instance, the allegation is that there was a attempt to tamper with and change a media company's messaging or postings about certain events that were happening around the election. There was some targeting of journalists. There were a whole variety of things that were going on. This was also directed, so this was charged in SDNY. That's where the indictment was, because there was activities that were directed at persons in the district. But it was being treated, notably, is being treated as a national security matter and is being prosecuted in conjunction with my former colleagues at National Security Division, because at the end of the day, these are state actors or state-sponsored actors that are behind these alleged attacks that we have here. So I think this is, in some ways, a couple of wrinkles here that I think are worth talking about for a second. So number one, obviously, we spent a lot of time in recent months talking about ransomware, talking about malicious cyber activity. This is sort of a different flavor and a different vein of that. Obviously, it's been a little while since we've talked about election interference, thankfully, but we're back there again, and it's another foreign power, another U.S. Adversary that is, alleged to be behind this one, Iran. Not that this is the first time that Iran has been publicly identified as having done something like this. The same was true in 2016. But as far as 2020 is concerned, this is sort of a new round and a new set of data points to sort of, for people to be aware of, to look into and to take a look at what was being done, what's alleged to have been done by these actors in an effort to try to undermine the election. And then the second is something that we've been talking about a lot, which is, look, this is kind of a hybrid approach, right? Where we see the OFAC designations, we see the indictment that's brought against at least a couple of the actors that are alleged to be involved here. and it's all being coordinated and rolled out kind of simultaneously. In part because I think the government realizes that you're getting a little more kind of splashy headlines and bang for your buck in terms of the visibility when you're sort of combining all these things. There's also, I think, a pretty substantial reward out for the information on the potential to help that could lead to the potential arrest of the two individuals who were charged in that criminal indictment. So, there's a lot that kind of goes behind this. This is, I can say with utmost certainty, these are among the most high-profile, high-priority cases that the Justice Department is working on and bringing at this moment. So, this goes all the way to the top and to the highest priorities that we will see enforcement-wise here. And again, it's a little bit of a different ilk than we're seeing with the ransomware attacks, but at the same time, it's kind of all of a piece and just sort of another illustration and another sort of thing to be aware of when it comes to this type of activity and understanding sort of the other ways that the U.S. government is trying to go about combating that. So with that, I'll sort of stop and throw it to Tim for his thoughts.
Not a lot of thoughts to add on. I mean, free and fair elections are appropriate and important in this country.
We're in favor of free and fair elections and not to have, it's very controversial. We're going to go out on a limb. Point. Embargoed is pro-democracy.
Pro-democracy.
Free and fair elections. Yes.
And anti-steal. So stop the steal. I 100% agree. Yeah. And to the extent
by the Iranians or otherwise.
Yes. Anyone who's trying to steal an election in the United States should be sanctioned. That's my view. And I'm going to. You heard it here first. I mean that I agree with you on all of the stuff about that. This is going to be a big priority. It's part of it's part and parcel of the focus on cyber that OFAC and really the enforcement agencies have started to go on. It's with Iran and not Russia, so it's kind of interesting. They didn't say a whole lot in the piece about like how or for what end these folks were trying to influence the election. I kind of would have liked to have heard about that because I suspect there's kind of an interesting story there, which they didn't hear. But regardless, I think that there's probably more to come, not just from Iran, from Russia, and the government is hard at work trying to combat it. And fortunately, it hasn't and doesn't change election results here, and hopefully it never will.
Yeah, and again, this is not sort of unprecedented. We have seen Iran engage in this type of conduct before, or actors who are acting, who are under orders or acting at the behest of the Iranian government before. So it's not groundbreaking in that regard. We have obviously seen less visibility, I think, on this angle than we have seen on the Russia angle in the past 2 election cycles, certainly in the U.S., but that's not to say that this is not just as big a concern or just as big a enforcement priority. So it'll be agree with Tim that I think we're going to see more here. It's just kind of another interesting wrinkle and another interesting kind of iteration on that same theme of focusing on cyber related malicious cyber activity, and in particular in this instance, targeting the elections here in the States. So I think we can leave that for now. But with that, let's turn to Russia and let's talk about a couple of our favorite topics, which are Ukraine and Europe's energy supply. And I'll toss it to Tim.
So a lot happening there, and I think this segment is also kind of a placeholder for what's going to really happen at some point in the near future. But basically, our old friend Ukraine, which is a U.S. ally, and Secretary Blinken was there within the last couple of weeks talking to the Ukrainians in light of a big Russian buildup, one of the biggest Russian army military buildups on the eastern Ukraine border since 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine and kept Crimea and still holds Crimea. And so there is concern with respect to that region of the world that there's, we're sitting on the edge of another powder keg that's about to go off, which prompted the the Russia sanctions to begin with. One piece of those sanctions includes sanctions on Nord Stream 2, which came out of a couple of congressional enactments that we've talked about, where the U.S. has the ability to impose sanctions on Nord Stream 2. By the time the Biden administration got into office, they made the call that Nord Stream 2 was so far along that they couldn't stop it with sanctions. And although they were not in favor of Nord Stream 2, don't like Nord Stream 2, they lifted some sanctions on Nord Stream 2, and it looked like the pipeline was going to be finished. The policy, the relationship between Nord Stream 2 and Ukraine is important to kind of think about in this conversation, and that is that currently Ukraine is one of the main ways that Russian energy gets into Europe. So it passes through Ukraine, and by passing through Ukraine, Ukraine takes a cut as any, transshipment hub takes, and so Ukraine makes a lot of money on Russian oil passing through Ukraine on its way to Europe. If Nord Stream 2 gets finished, that route doesn't go through Ukraine, and so all of that energy coming into Europe will go via Nord Stream 2 and not via Ukraine, so they'll lose business. It also will increase the ability of Russia to essentially cut the flow on the pipeline at any point, which is what the U.S. is so worried about, is that Europe will become more and more dependent on Russian oil, and Russia will have leverage if it wants to cut off the flow of the oil to hold Europe hostage in a way that we saw happen kind of with the Colonial Pipeline here. So that's the big fuss about Nord Stream 2. The reason it was in the news in the last week, it's not the news articles actually had some kind of breathless headlines. I think the one that I'm looking at right now from the New York Times is Germany suspends approval of Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and that makes you think. So Germany had been the biggest supporter of Nord Stream 2. Chancellor Merkel is transitioning out of office now that she's in the process of retiring. A new government from a different political party is coming in. She was a huge champion of Nord Stream 2. Her party was. This article, the headline, the timing, it starts to make you think, well, maybe the new government is going to be less friendly, and this is all part of a denial of approval process, and Germany is going to turn away from Nord Stream 2. But then when you read the article, all it says is that there was an application deadline, and Nord Stream 2 was supposed to have established a German sub by a certain date, and hasn't yet established the German subsidiary. It was trying to use a Swiss subsidiary, and the Germans said, no, you really need to use a German subsidiary, and so we're not going to take your application until the subsidiary is established. I mean, as you and I and probably most listeners of the pod know, it's not very hard to set up a subsidiary. It's just a matter of paperwork and trying to figure out who's going to serve in what role. So this is not some sort of development that is really going to jeopardize the completion of Nord Stream 2. It's just going to slow it down by a little bit. And so, but the headlines were a little bit too they made it seem too consequential. It seems like this is just a bump in the road. It may be that the new German government takes another view of Nord Stream 2, although I tend to doubt it. But whether they will or not, this development really doesn't have that much to do with it.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add there, or the thing that kind of struck me about it, was, in light of the posturing and the military buildup that we're seeing in Russia, that is, kind of overtly threatening Ukraine, to the point where I think in one of the news articles or one of the reports I saw that the director of the CIA was whisked away to Moscow to have sort of a high-level talk with the folks at the Kremlin about what's going on, and
that was a little worrisome.
Trying to diffuse the situation so that we don't end up in World War III or something similar. So that apparently, or at least reportedly, happened pretty recently. So with that as the backdrop, and with a lot of hard rhetoric flying across kind of back and forth, and things, the U.S. has taken a tougher tone on Russia, certainly since Biden has been in, but I wouldn't say that there's been anything that's been sort of terribly, noteworthy or incendiary that has happened going in either direction, really, in the last year. And certainly that we've been tracking. And so, with the pause that's happening with Nord Stream 2 kind of getting final approval, whether it's a pure kind of administrative holdup or not, or whether that's a pretext for something else, I don't know. But in all events, there is not going to be any gas flowing this winter, it seems, as a result of this holdup. And so that is going to put a strain on the gas that's being supplied into Germany, into Europe, and given the shortages that already exist, that is going to ratchet up tensions to some degree. So there is that on the one hand, and on the other hand, we do have Putin deciding to play a little bit of chicken with Ukraine and the U.S. and other Western ally and their collective Western allies to see kind of how far he can go with kind of threatening and seeing sort of whether or not there could be some push to action or further events that may transpire here that could really be consequential. So I think, as Tim said, I think we do view it as largely a placeholder for now, but I do think it's been a little while since we've kind of weighed in and checked in on this whole situation. Secretary Blinken made one of the the kind of breathless quotes, as Tim said, that was attributed to him was like, Russia's got to be careful about making a big mistake here or something. I'm paraphrasing, but it's something to that effect.
Right.
And that's a little more than your sort of average kind of mundane, just trading barbs in press releases or in press conferences. So, we shall see. But I think the cocktail of what's happening with the military buildup, Nord Stream 2 being on pause at least for a little while, and the U.S. still having the ability to do something there, perhaps if they want to, and to make things messy, and the new German government that's coming in or about to come in. I just think there's a lot of moving parts there and a lot of potential that we could see, something sort of interesting or new emerge out of this kind of collection of circumstances in the next few months. So that's part of the reason we wanted to highlight it.
Oh yeah, it's definitely a powder keg, and I didn't mean to suggest anything otherwise. And it's definitely worth talking about because, this could turn into a huge international crisis at any moment because there's lots of signs there. All I meant was, in terms of the alarmist headlines, was just like the headlines made it sound like there was a big change in the developments with respect to Nord Stream 2. And the fact is nothing's really happened to change it other than, the slowdown will change when energy gets to Europe. And so that could create shortages. And then, there's people making statements in the media that suggest that this may have been intentional. And then,
it's not like the Germans have flip-flopped as a substantive matter on whether they support the project or not. Yes, correct. And that was a little bit misleading, at least at first blush. But yeah, I agree. So anyway, this is an area we keep a close watch on because it has huge consequences for U.S. trade and sanctions policy and our friends in Western Europe and lots of other areas of the world. So we will certainly be keeping a close watch on this, and I'm sure we'll be coming back to this in the new year, if not sooner. So we will leave that for now. So let's now pause for the lightning round sound effect, and we'll go to the final two topics. Number one, which is a really interesting one in many ways, which is for those who have been tracking this recently, the U.S. has just kind of reiterated very recent. So to back up a step, President Biden and President Xi just had their virtual summit, where they kind of traded, platitudes about and sort of soft warnings to one another about U.S.-China relations, and tried to at least mend some fences, perhaps, to suggest that the U.S. and China could work with some degree of harmony going forward into in the coming years after things being so fraught for the past several years. That just wrapped up very recently. I'm forgetting the date when it wrapped, but earlier this month. And so shortly on the heels of that, there became a lot of chatter started coming out about the upcoming Beijing Olympics, which Beijing, of course, is hosting the Winter Olympics 2022. And that also brought about some calls for the U.S. and other allies to potentially boycott the Beijing Olympics as a show of as a rebuke to the Chinese government and their record on human rights and anti-democratic practices. And notably, of course, with respect to Xinjiang, with respect to Hong Kong, with respect to many of the issues that we spend a lot of time talking about and that underpin a lot of what's going on with respect to U.S. trade policy vis-a-vis China. And one way that this has materialized or that has come about is that, there's been a suggestion, and apparently there are live discussions about this going on at the highest circles of government, for the U.S. to engage in a diplomatic boycott of the Olympics, which would amount to no U.S. government officials would attend and kiss the ring of the Chinese government, essentially. And as somebody pointed out, I think not incorrectly, give them photo ops with high-ranking U.S. government officials on the one hand, high-ranking Chinese government officials on the other hand, that could then be spun by the propagandists in China as tacit U.S. approval for China's broader policy, whether it be with respect to Xinjiang or Hong Kong or anything else. But it would not involve pulling U.S. athletes. It would simply involve no formal U.S. kind of political or state delegation to accompany the team to Beijing. So given that, and there have been calls from both sides of the aisle in Congress to do this, some China hawks, including Senator Cotton, have said he's called, I think, for a full boycott. And then there are others on the Dem side that have said, diplomatic boycott's the way to go. I think if history is any teacher here, when President Carter decided to pull the U.S. Olympic team out of the Moscow Olympics in 1980, I think that is largely seen as an epic failure in hindsight, because it didn't really accomplish anything. It sort of was seen as a soft rebuke to the USSR at the time, and it kind of left the U.S. open to a lot of criticism. It sort of undercut and crushed the dreams of hundreds of U.S. athletes who didn't get to participate in those games. Obviously, Moscow returned the favor in 1984. And then at the end of it, what do we have out of those two events? I don't know if there's really much to speak of in terms of lasting consequences. So I think that is certainly underpinning a lot of the thinking on this. But at the end of the day, we are talking about the same kind of policy considerations that are at the heart of all of the kind of U.S. sanctions and U.S. trade policies that we spend, again, most of our time talking about on this pod and thinking about. So, Tim, quick thoughts. What do you think about a diplomatic boycott of the Olympics?
Well, I'll start where you left off, because this was kind of where I came to it on. I mean, why are we talking about this on this podcast? And the reason is this is kind of a soft...
Good question.
Right? I mean, but the reason is, apart from the fact that we're both kind of sports fanatics, and so like
That's
anything that has to do with the Olympics, we'd rather talk about that than, say, like Nordstrom 2 or what have you. But I mean, I think that it does make a lot of sense to talk about it here. And the reason is that this is kind of a form of soft power. I mean, soft foreign policy influence is really kind of within the realm of sanctions. It's not a sanction per se, but it's our government trying to take action against a foreign government that doesn't involve military force, that involves kind of a walling off, if you will, of the country in a particular way. I agree with you. The 1980 Olympic boycott is pretty widely seen as a failure, because I think the main victim of that boycott was the not only the U.S. athletes, but the international athletic community. I mean, it tainted the gold medals of the people who won, who were kind of collateral damage in that sense, because they didn't have all of the countries that were there the same way in the 1984 Olympics. Anybody who won a gold medal, in some sense, that those medals are tainted because they weren't, all of the competitors weren't necessarily there. And it's not to take away from any of the medalists in those games, but that is kind of seen as one of the problems with that. And
if any gold medalists from 1980 or 1984 are listening, we are not meaning to throw shade on your medals.
No,
so please don't tweet at us. We have nothing but respect for you, and carry on.
Good job, guys. but basically, what it didn't accomplish was really put that much hurt to the Russian government at the time. And here, I think the level of hurt that pulling the athletes out is the main recipient of the damage is somebody whose behavior you're not trying to change, and the damage to the government is to the government whose behavior you are trying to change is so slight as to not be worth it. A diplomatic boycott strikes me as kind of an easy fix to that, right? I mean, you get the publicity of a quote unquote boycott without actually having to harm anyone, because I can't imagine that any of the U.S. diplomats who aren't going to be able to go to the Olympic Games in China in 2022 are going to be that torn up about it. And so, a couple of work trips are canceled. Some high publicity photo ops are taken away from the Chinese government. Again, the harm isn't that much, but at least the harm to the Chinese government is not going to be that much. But it's a little bit of bad publicity at a time when they were hoping to get nothing but positive publicity, and it's a little bit less of a show of support from the U.S. government for anything Chinese, which right now in this political climate, I'm not surprised that it's bipartisan in that sense. But I think it strikes me as kind of the measured approach as opposed to the full boycott that President Carter did of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. So good, bully for them if they do.
Yeah, we'll see. I would add, just to hop onto a point Tim made, which is a good one. If we think of sanctions, ultimately, everything we talk about, proper economic sanctions, as being partially to change conduct and to have sort of actual real world consequences, partially to as a sort of messaging, marketing, communications tool to spread the word and the policy goals of the U.S. broadly across the global community, then that's what a diplomatic boycott would be intended to do. Obviously, it would be intended to sort of spread that message and to hopefully get some allied countries to get on board, U.S. allies to get on board with that as well, and perhaps raise awareness in certain circles around the globe where maybe these issues that are going on in China are not as well known, or are perhaps carefully monitored and censored, and such that they're not sort of getting the full story and the full kind of background on this. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I think it cuts both ways, because it does run the risk, again, I think, of being seen as kind of a weak measure that doesn't really have much teeth to it. And I think will open the U.S. to, perhaps ridicule in some circles, and maybe that matters, maybe it doesn't. But I think that, that would be a comparatively small price to pay if it does raise that awareness to the degree that I think the folks who are pushing this in U.S. government are hoping it will.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the comeback to that is that it's all a weak measure. I mean, there's just not much behavior changing that you'll get whether you pull the athletes or not. And I think, as the world becomes a bigger and more diverse place, the U.S. presence at the Olympics is going to be missed less and less. Obviously, it would be missed if the U.S. were to pull out, but is that sort of step worth it when you consider all of the harm that would come to the athletes from that taking place? It's just hard to justify.
Right. Yeah.
They're all weak measures.
Yeah.
Even that would be a weak measure. And so, do you want to do a weak measure that has a huge amount of collateral damage, or a weak measure that has much less collateral damage? For option B.
That's fair. That's a fair point. All right. And with that, let's move on to lightning round number 2 topic, Burundi. And I'll toss it to Tim.
So a sanctions success story. So the whole goal of sanctions is to end sanctions, because you want to have the changed behavior. And Burundi is a success story in that respect. Now, whether sanctions had anything to do with it, that could be debated. But back in 2015, Burundi was in a form of crisis. The two-term president there, announced that he was going to run for a third term, even though the Constitution didn't allow for a third term. There was all sorts of chaos that ensued as a result. There were also human rights violations going on at the time. And so the U.S. imposed sanctions against Burundi. They were targeted sanctions, but they were designed to essentially restore democracy to Burundi and end human rights violations. And after that crisis abated some, because Burundi decided to go to adopt a constitutional amendment that would have allowed the president to run for a third term, but he opted out of running for a third term. And so when his term ended in 2020, actually a little before his term ended, because that president wound up dying, but as his term was going to end in 2020, there was an election in Burundi, and it was by all accounts, a free and fair election. The new president was elected. He instituted various human rights reforms, and the U.S. government reviewed their policy with respect to Burundi. And on November 18th, it terminated the sanctions program, meaning that all of the assets that were blocked are now unblocked. All of the SDNs from the Burundi program are no longer SDNs. And at some point in the near future, just as with the Sudan regulations and a couple of other regulations before them, those regulations are going to be pulled out of the code, and there will be no Burundi sanctions regulations anymore.
Right. I think only two quick points to add to that. Number one, as Tim went through, the transfer of power following free and fair elections, that's the key event here.
We're for that too.
Yeah, we're very much for that. And even though that is the kind of stated purpose in some of these programs, for example, Venezuela, that's a long way off, or it's sort of many moves ahead on the chessboard in some cases. But with respect to Burundi, as Tim said, a relatively short amount of time, just from kind of tail end of the Obama era to 2021 to have that play out, about 6 years. And then the second is to Tim's other comment about whether or not the U.S. program had any impact. My understanding is, and again, I can't claim to have had many questions about the Burundi program over the years, or this was a program that was largely, I think, kind of ignored during the Trump era. But there were multilateral sanctions that were imposed, not just U.S., EU, and the African Union as well. And so, I think there's a case to be made that multilateral pressure allowed for there to eventually be a pathway to have those elections and to have the transfer of power, and to allow for kind of coming out of the crisis period that led to the standing up of the program in the first place. So again, just not too much more to say about it than that, but just given that we sometimes, again, we sort of lose the forest for the trees. Like, why is the U.S. doing this, or why are we doing this? Why do these things even exist? This is why, is that you sort of you hopefully clear a path through sanctions to allow for some concrete outcome. We have that outcome here. Hopefully there will be no backsliding like we've seen with Burma, and but a positive development, obviously, and a sort of a mini roadmap to how these programs can, in fact, should go away when these goals are achieved.
No, absolutely, and I didn't mean to suggest that the sanctions didn't play a role in it.
No.
I don't have any empirical evidence either way. But
I'm not claiming that I know either. But I think there's at least some kind of a case to be made, perhaps, that this was a contributing factor, maybe.
Well, and they had a narrow goal. It was a smaller country, and it was multilateral sanctions. And so, the fact that the behavior changed is at least some evidence that the sanctions were working, and the behavior changed, as you pointed out, Brian, pretty quickly. And so this is a good example, a textbook example, in my view, of when sanctions should work, and they may well have worked here. And certainly the behavior has changed to the extent that the sanctions are now gone, which is good.
And our congratulations to the good people of Burundi and the government of Burundi, which is now, in fact, sanctions free, as we always implore our listeners to be. So that is good for them. So in any event, no, not to make light of it, a significant development, obviously, and something that, ending on a bit of a positive note after talking about a lot of spending most of our time today and otherwise talking about a lot of difficult and dire circumstances that prompt these actions. So I think that's a good note to end on. And so with that, I think we are now wrapped. Again, we are expecting this will be up shortly after Thanksgiving in the U.S. So to anybody who is here in the States, or perhaps outside the States, that celebrates Thanksgiving, we hope everybody has a happy, healthy, safe Thanksgiving with your family. And until next time, until perhaps our final episode of the year, our year-end extravaganza, we hope everybody stays well and, of course, stays sanctions free.
Happy Thanksgiving, everybody, and stay sanctions free.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.